Hi, so this is another video in the SQL 50 series, and I'll be solving a medium question. So yeah, let's get into it. So the table that we are working with today is an activity table, and we have four columns in the table: player ID, device, their event date, and games played. And player ID and event date is a combined primary key for this table, and the table, it shows the activity of players of some game. Then each row is a record of player who logged in and played a number of games, possibly zero, before logging out on some day using some device. Okay, so we know that this is an activity table where we have the player ID and the device with which they logged in, and the event date, the date when they logged in and played some game, and then we also have the number of games that they played. Now what we have to do is we have to write a solution to report the fraction of players that logged in again on the day after the day they first logged in, and we have to round it to two decimal places. In other words, you need to count the number of players that logged in for at least two consecutive days starting from their first login date, and then divide it by the total number of players. Okay, so let's have a look at the data. So we have a player ID, device, event date, and games played. And what we need to find out is a fraction of users who logged in again after their first login. So the first login is important here. Okay, so if we see the first player, they logged in on 1st March, and then they again immediately after their first login they logged in the second day, which is 2nd March. And second user, they did not log in after their first login. The third player, they did log in after their first login, but it was not immediately after their first login date. It was the next, I don't know, it was later, in the later months. So I think the only player that meets the criteria is the first player for this case. Okay, let's list down what we need to do. Is our output will have just one column, that's the fraction of users who logged in immediately after their first login, as the fraction of user players who logged in after their first login the next day, right? After their first login. How will we find that? We need to find the first login of players and then the next login date, right? So if it's the next login date is the current date, the first login date plus the next day, we have the users that we need, and then we'll divide it by total number of players that logged in, and we'll have the fraction of those users, and we have to round it to two decimal places. Two decimal, round to two decimal. Okay, so let's start by writing the query. Select from activity table. Let's just player ID. Device isn't that important for us. Then we have an event date, and games plays is also not important in our case. So we have player ID and then the event ID, and what we need to find is the first login date for each user, right? And in fact, even after finding the first login date for that user, we have to find the second login for that. And how we can do that is, what I can think of is using a lead function, because with lead, for every first row I can find the next row, the next date in that table. And once I have the next date, I can just subtract it and if it's 1, I know that they logged in the very second day. If it's not, then those are not the users that I want. So just to give you an example, lead date, there can be, like, there are multiple ways to do it. This is how I think, like, I can think of right now. Partition by, because I like Windows functions. um, I'll partition it by player ID, because we have to find the first login date for each player. So I'm grouping it by player ID, and I'll order it by event date, just to show you, is as next day. Right, so for every user I can see the next day, and this is the player wise, right? So for player 1, for the event 1, the next date is 2. For for the second row it's null, because there's no other entry for the first user, player 1. For 2 also null, because there's no other entry. For 3 I see the next date, and for next row it's null, because there's no other entry. Right, so this is what I wanted. Now I want the difference, because I want to see if the this event date minus the next day, if it's 1, difference between these both dates is 1, then I know that the user, the player, they logged in the next day. What I can do is, with the date diff function, I can find the difference between these dates. I want the number of days, so I'll say date difference day, then event date, and then the next row, sorry, the next column, I don't need to alias it here, and I have a difference date. Let's run this and see. Okay, so we see that the difference between first and second date is 1. That's correct. Null, that's okay. For this it's 853 days. Yeah, that's not the one we need. Okay, so we have it. So the next thing is to get, okay, so now there could be multiple, okay, so right now with this test case it's just the first, because what if there is a, what if the player 1, they logged in after 2nd March also? If they logged in on 3rd March also, then I'll also get difference of 1 for the second row, and I don't want that, because we just want to see all those users who logged in after the first login. So what I will do is, sorry, I can use rank or row number. In this case anything will work, and the same partition, so that we have rank for each. You can use row number also, just rank number as row num. Okay, and now I have all the fields that I need. I'll put it under, because now I have just a part of the query, and now I need to use that query to build my final output. I'll just put it under a CTE. We can also make a subquery out of it, but I like to do it through CTE. I can say player game or player activity. Now I can say select. Now we have to get the fraction of players, we divide this difference, the count of these users, by total number of users. So I'm selecting from player activity here. So we'll write the case statement. So case when my difference of date is 1, and it's only for those rows where my row number is 1. It's only we're checking only for the first state. We don't need, because if for this particular test case that doesn't apply, but there could be a third row and it will take that also into consideration, but we do not need that. So I'll say when my row number is 1 and the date difference between this and the second row is 1, then that's the row I want, else it's 0, and then I'll just sum it. Then I can divide it by the count of total players. Now I need distinct because there are multiple rows for a single player, so I'll say distinct player ID, and I think that's it. Just multiply it by 0 to get a decimal. I'll just give it a name, fraction, and to just finish it up, we'll just round it by 2 decimal place, and I'll run the query. Okay, some issue somewhere. It says that incorrect syntax near the select. Player ID. And row number, and this looks good. The difference else, and count distinct player ID. Well, okay, I missed as, and yep, it's good to go. I'll submit this, and yes, it's accepted. So for this query, what we did is we again just broke down the query into 2 parts. So first we calculated the date difference between our first date for the player, the first login date, and the immediately next day. So we checked if there is a difference of 1 day, if it is, and then also we gave another condition that we want to check this condition only for the first row, the first login for each user. And then once we had all those columns ready, we just used them to calculate our fraction of users. We divided those users who logged in immediately after their first login, and then divided it by the total number of users or players that logged in, and we have our fraction. And yeah, so that's it for this video. Thank you.